May 18th, the year 526. The sun sets over the Orontes River Valley, casting long shadows across the limestone streets of Antioch. Near the great colonnade, merchants pack away their textiles while the warm scent of bread drifts from the public ovens. In the octagonal basilica, the faithful walk quietly beneath heavy marble columns. Everything feels perfectly normal. But what they do not know is that just 14 miles beneath their feet, a massive geological force has just pushed past its breaking point. In less than 12 hours, 250,000 lives will be buried under the collapse of their own urban engineering. What exactly was happening inside the third largest city of the Roman Empire just moments before the ultimate silence? To truly grasp the sheer scale of what happened that night, we need to take a step back. We must look at what Antioch stood for before it vanished beneath the dust of history. Founded in the year 300 before Christ by Seleucus I Nicator, this metropolis was not just a simple pit stop on the map of the ancient world. It was the beating heart of the Eastern Empire, a melting pot of cultures, languages, and booming trade routes. Built in the fertile alluvial valley of the Orontes River, just 12 miles from the waters of the Mediterranean Sea, the city thrived. It blossomed in a geographical cradle that was, against all odds, both its greatest blessing and its most terrible, hidden death sentence. The local geography dictated the rhythm of daily life. On one side to the west stood the towering Amanus mountain range. On the other, to the east, the steep slopes of Mount Silpius. Between these massive natural walls of rock, the ground beneath their homes was forged by thousands of years of fine sediment left behind by constant flooding. It was exceptionally rich soil for farming, easily capable of feeding the masses. But it was deeply and silently unstable, far too weak to bear the relentless weight of human progress. By the year 526, the urban sprawl was dense. It covered roughly 2.3 square miles of non-stop human activity. But Antioch was not a flat, easy-to-walk city. There was a sudden, steep drop in elevation, plunging about 260 feet between the noisy commercial districts packed by the riverbanks and the quiet villas carved into the higher mountain peaks. To keep this giant machine running smoothly, Byzantine engineering relied on breathtaking suspended aqueducts. Heavy structures crossed the valleys, held up by limestone arches reaching up to 100 feet in the air. They poured thousands of gallons of fresh water into the public baths and fountains day in and day out. Have you ever stopped to wonder what happens when mankind places blind faith in its own creations, entirely forgetting the unmeasurable forces at work deep underground? As we walk through the shadows of this forgotten metropolis, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. If you want to understand history, not through shallow summaries, but by feeling the true heavy weight of the events that shaped our civilization, you are in the right place. Your presence here helps keep the memory alive, honoring those whom time tried to erase. The great documentary tragedy of Antioch is that absolutely no complete map of its city layout survived. The exact blueprint of its narrow streets, the borders of its neighborhoods, and the floor plans of its massive markets are gone forever. And this did not happen because old parchments simply faded away over time. The cold, hard truth is that the city's municipal archives, the bureaucratic heart, where its local identity was kept safe, were swallowed whole by the very ground they stood on. The sheer force of what was about to unfold was so devastating, it wiped out the physical proof that many of those places ever existed. What we know today has been pieced together from fragments and ruins buried deep within the earth. And what this archaeology of disaster reveals is truly disturbing. The doom of those 250,000 people was not just a random twist of fate. The death trap of Antioch had been built brick by brick, completely out of sight, over many decades of choices that seemed perfectly harmless. Between the years 450 and 520, the skyline of Antioch began to shift drastically. The city was swept up in a building frenzy, bankrolled by a powerful new elite. These were the great merchants, men who had piled up untold wealth by controlling the Persian silk routes flowing west to the sea. But there was a major catch. The Orontes River Valley and the surrounding mountains severely choked the city's horizontal space. If Antioch could not spread outward, the only logical way to house the booming population and show off this new wealth was to build upward. And it was exactly this harmless logic that began to seal the fate of thousands of families. The city's master builders started putting up residential buildings that were 3, even 4 stories high. Today, we wouldn't think twice about that. But the hidden flaw below ground was a ticking time bomb. These new top-heavy vertical structures were being stacked right on top of ancient foundations. Many of them had been laid back in the Hellenistic period over 6 centuries earlier. The deadliest detail of all is that those 100-year-old bases were designed by ancient architects to hold, at the very most, a single-story home. Nobody seemed to care about what lay beneath the dirt, as long as the facades looked grand and the upper floors offered killer views of the metropolis. To speed up construction and cash in on profits, the builders made another call that just seemed like smart business. They started using a highly porous limestone dug straight out of the local quarries of Mount Silpius. This material was roughly 20% cheaper than the solid marble shipped in from other provinces. Plus, it was much faster and easier to cut into large blocks. To hold up the roofs and the upper floors, engineers used massive beams of Lebanese cedar. The fatal technical flaw, completely invisible to the naked eye, was exactly how this wood was put in place. The heavy logs were simply shoved into open holes in the stone masonry. There was no bracing, no mortar, and no metal reinforcement holding them together. All of this was considered perfectly normal. This building method was the gold standard of the day, fully inspected and green-lit by the authorities and the city's Builder Guild inspectors. It was just the daily grind of progress. Before we dive into what this massive pile of weight would trigger when the earth finally woke up, I want to take a quick pause and ask a favor. Please drop a comment down below and let us know what city and state you're watching from. We truly want to connect with our viewers to see how far these stories are traveling, and we love reading and replying to every single comment. Your engagement is what keeps this channel thriving. Getting back to the dusty construction sites of the 6th century, we need to get inside the heads of those engineers. Not a single master builder back then stopped to think that stacking 4 tons of spongy limestone onto 600-year-old foundations could be a fatal mistake. And they had a very practical reason for hanging on to this false sense of security. No major earthquake had hit Antioch since the year 458. That was exactly 68 years of dead, geological silence. Nearly 3 whole generations were born, grew up, and grew old without ever feeling the ground truly shake beneath their feet. To the locals, the earth was solid, the foundations were eternal, and mankind's destiny in Antioch was secured high in the sky. They simply did not know that this long stretch of peace was not the end of the danger. It was the quiet buildup of a ruthless energy that very soon would come to collect its debt. Between the years 512 and 525, this false sense of safety collided head-on with a massive population boom. The number of people in Antioch skyrocketed from roughly 180,000 to over 250,000 souls. That was a staggering 40% spike in just 13 years. This overcrowding in the streets did not happen by accident. Merchant caravans and entire families were migrating non-stop. They were running from the chaos on the eastern land routes, looking for safe haven and a chance to make a living behind the walls of the great metropolis. The real-world fallout of this mass migration was the total chokehold of the city's space. One of the most packed districts, jammed right at the foot of Mount Silpius, saw its population density multiply by 3 in no time at all. Whole families, who used to live in modest, single-story homes, started renting out those newly built upper floors. These were rushed expansions of wood and stone, resting on ancient frames that were never, ever meant to hold double the people, double the furniture, and double the dead weight. The constant rush to put a roof over so many heads completely blinded the local government to the danger. In the year 520, the city council signed off on a project that perfectly captures the quiet negligence creeping into the engineering of the time. They greenlit the construction of a massive, brand-new covered market, spanning 2 whole floors in one of the busiest commercial hubs. To hold up the monumental roof, builders brought in heavy cedar wood beams. The invisible mistake, once again, lay in the supporting bases. Instead of demanding fresh, sturdy columns straight from the quarries, they chose to recycle abandoned marble pillars from old Roman temples. These were heavy columns that already had over 600 years of weathering on their backs. The most terrifying detail of this architectural gamble is that the city's own official maintenance reports, written back in the year 490, had already flagged deep, vertical cracks in those exact stones. Even with a paper trail proving the structural weakness, the cracked pillars were stood back up, locked into place to hold the crushing weight of the new trade center. From that day forward, hundreds of citizens would walk, trade, and chat right beneath a death trap, held up by shattered stone. Nobody in the streets or in the artisan guilds called it an extreme risk. The real danger in Antioch wasn't born from a single bad call by a greedy architect or official. The collapse was being quietly staged by the silent pileup of thousands of small, everyday urban choices made over 2 straight decades. It was just everyday people trying to squeeze in more neighbors, sell more goods, and keep up the frantic pace of a commercial hub that could not and would not stop growing. They had no way of knowing, but the absolute physical limit of the city's ancient foundations had been reached, and deep underground, the earth, which had seemed so fast asleep, was starting to wake up. To understand how this trap snapped shut so perfectly around its citizens, we have to rewind the clock back to the year 458. exactly 68 years before the ultimate tragedy. On that night, in the dead of the early morning, a moderate earthquake rattled the bones of Antioch. The shaking wasn't long or strong enough to flatten the metropolis, but it packed enough punch to bring down 7 stone commercial buildings down by the port. And this is exactly where history leaves behind a stunning and deeply tragic paper trail. The city prefect at the time, an administrator named Flavius Dionysius, moved fast. He ordered a top-to-bottom inspection of the rubble and filed an official administrative report breaking down the damage. While mapping out the disaster zone to rebuild, the Byzantine inspectors noticed something highly specific, but they simply lacked the scientific know-how to grasp the sheer horror of what they were looking at. The buildings that came down weren't just randomly scattered across the blocks. They formed a perfect diagonal geometric line slicing straight through the city grid, from the southwest to the northeast. Without even realizing it, Mayor Flavius Dionysius had just documented, on bureaucratic parchment, the physical footprint of one of the most unforgiving geological monsters on the planet. That exact diagonal line of ruin was the surface scar of the Levant fault system, a massive, complex web of tectonic fractures tearing through the Earth's crust for over 600 miles, stretching all the way from the Gulf of Aqaba to the distant Taurus Mountains. The deadly truth about this fault line wouldn't be fully understood until centuries after the lights of Antioch went out. In the year 1997, modern geologists drilled down and pulled up long sediment cores from the bottom of the Orontes River Valley. The Earth, unlike human records that fade away, kept a flawless, bulletproof diary of the past. Looking at these soil samples revealed 18 distinct layers of extreme seismic destruction, perfectly dated between the year 150 before Christ and that fateful year of 526. The hidden math beneath the soil was chilling. Every 37 years on average, the fault unleashed its fury, and the entire valley shook with terrifying violence. The Byzantine engineers and architects of the 6th century, of course, did not have access to this 1,000-year big picture. They weren't amateurs, and they weren't blind to the ground they walked on. Everyone in Antioch knew perfectly well that their metropolis sat on an active seismic zone. Small, harmless tremors rattled the city almost every decade. They were quick, little shakes that did nothing more than swing the heavy chandeliers in the marble churches and ripple the fresh water in the grand public baths. However, the city council and the master builders made a fatal mistake in how they read the signs. They looked at their own recent past, checked the city's memory, and realized that no major disaster, no great cracks in the earth had happened since that one isolated event down by the port in the year 458. They took those nearly 7 decades of total calm as a clear, undeniable sign that the earth had finally settled down. For the proud Builders Guild, the geological stability was locked in for good. And because of that, they kept stacking limestone blocks, cedar beams, new floors, and tens of thousands of people right up toward the sky. But what they couldn't see is that the mechanics of our planet never forgive, and they never rest. That unusually long 68-year silence didn't mean the pressure was gone. It meant the exact opposite. The crushing, colossal force of 2 entire continental land masses was gridlocked, stuck in the dark, building up an unimaginable amount of energy roughly 14 miles beneath the crowded alleys, homes, and markets of the city. A blind, unreachable depth where no ancient tool could ever spot the fracture that was just waiting to snap. The elastic limit of the bedrock below was running out, millimeter by millimeter. The city kept breathing, walking, and cashing in, totally unaware that the ground was seconds away from demanding its final payment. On the morning of May 19th, the year 526, when the sun finally rose over the Orontes River Valley, the third largest metropolis of the empire no longer existed as a place meant for the living. The ultimate collapse was not a slow burn. Cross-referenced records from the time, paired with modern simulations, point out that the main shockwave lasted just over 7 agonizing minutes, hitting a colossal force estimated between a 7 and a 7.5 on the Richter scale. In those short, brutal moments, the fate of entire generations was locked in stone and dust. The scale of the physical wipeout was nearly absolute. Out of the 2.3 square miles of densely packed urban sprawl, about 1.5 square miles were leveled to the ground. The structural failure was exactly what the architectural death trap had been setting up for decades. The top-heavy, 3- and 4-story residential buildings, pieced together with spongy limestone over weak foundations, lost the support of their loose cedar beams. They cascaded violently, pancaking down into narrow streets that were only about 16 feet wide. With zero room to run and falling masonry raining from the sky, thousands of people had their escape routes instantly cut off. The Byzantine chronicler John Malalas, who survived the disaster only because he was traveling out of town, documented that roughly 250,000 people met their end in less than a single hour. In the dead center of this nightmare, the great octagonal basilica, built by Emperor Constantine, stood as the final ray of hope for so many. For almost 200 years, its massive walls had shrugged off smaller quakes, making the church the natural psychological safe haven where hundreds of citizens sprinted during the first few seconds of the shaking. But the engineering of the basilica had also hit its mechanical breaking point. The massive central dome, boasting an impressive span of nearly 90 feet, simply could not handle the twisting force of the tectonic fault line, and it caved inward. The crowd that sought divine shelter inside was instantly crushed by the very roof and columns that, just hours before, had proudly held the sanctuary high. The aftermath cut the region off from the rest of the known world. The ancient trade routes and aqueducts were turned into impassable mountains of rubble. By the time the massive rescue crews, deployed by Emperor Justinian I, finally pushed their way in from Constantinople, 17 days had already passed. And the sight that those men found as they dug through the guts of the metropolis forms one of the most heartbreaking, deeply human portraits ever recorded in the history of urban disasters. They did not just find the victims of a geological glitch. They uncovered cruel snapshots of daily routines that were violently cut short. Beneath the heavy limestone, workers and soldiers found bodies locked in positions of ultimate sacrifice, revealing people hunched over in a desperate, impossible bid to shield children from the crushing weight of the collapse. Other survivors of those first few seconds were found pinned down, gripping tightly to whatever they tried to save in the pitch black and the panic Stiff hands clutched scattered bronze coins, protective religious statues, and in the most gut-wrenching silent detail of that morning, many held onto heavy iron keys, keys that were still tied to their waists, meant to unlock doors, homes, and lives that simply did not exist anymore. Time has a strange, almost cruel, and utterly silent way of burying the greatest mistakes of mankind. The limestone wreckage of that tragic May morning in the year 526 eventually became, in a dark and deeply ironic twist, the exact new bedrock upon which future generations decided to rebuild their lives. The fallen boulders, the splintered cedar beams, and the brutally silent stories of 250,000 people were slowly blanketed by layer after layer of dirt, dust, forgetting, and fresh urban ambition. The grand, towering Byzantine metropolis was quite literally wiped off the sunlit surface of the earth. But the ghost of its flawed architecture stayed fast asleep in the pitch dark, just a few feet below ground. And the hardest lesson that the archaeology of disaster throws in our face is that when we choose to bury our own history without truly understanding it, it always finds a way to repeat itself, striking back with the exact same ruthless mechanical force. We jump forward in time, leaving behind the emperors of Constantinople, the wealthy, bustling Persian silk routes, and the ancient Roman mosaics that dressed the villas of Mount Silpius. We cross through centuries of human history, passing empires and world wars, until we hit the month of October in the year 2023. Today, the modern, loud, and vibrant Turkish city of Antioch stands precisely on those very same geographic coordinates, sitting on the exact same ancient alluvial soil, and, most terrifying of all, built directly on top of the sealed ruins of the old, forgotten Antioch. The surface world had completely changed its face. Fast, hot asphalt took the place of slow cobblestones. Glass high-rises replaced the ancient colonnades, but the dark, brooding geography deep down below hadn't changed one bit. And in that month of October, the earth that seemed so fast asleep woke up once again to collect a terrifying new toll. A massive earthquake, smashing the dreaded mark of 7.8 in magnitude, ripped through the entire region. It redrew the landscape with a crushing force that echoed the exact terror of the 6th century. The human body count was, once again, earth-shattering for our modern times. Over 50,000 people met a tragic end in a matter of seconds, swallowed up in the dark by the total, unforgiving collapse of thousands of modern structures that everyone thought were bulletproof. But it was in the agonizing days that followed that the true heavy weight of history showed its face. When modern rescue crews kicked off the grueling, heartbreaking job of clearing the rubble, working in the freezing cold with heavy machinery, giant cranes, and cutting-edge acoustic sensors, they ran into an underground reality that chilled the blood of every historian, geologist, and structural engineer on the scene. The massive reinforced concrete slabs and the twisted, heavy steel beams of the modern high-rises had come crashing down, stone on stone, iron on iron, and they landed squarely on top of the old invisible Roman and Byzantine foundations. These were highly complex structural bases that today's builders had never properly mapped out. They stayed hidden simply because they were heavily locked away beneath countless tons of layered debris, left behind not just by the apocalyptic event of the year 526, but also by other massive, destructive quakes loosely recorded in the years 528 and 1872. The ground beneath Antioch wasn't solid earth. It was a massive, fragile architectural graveyard. The mammoth Levant fault system, the exact same tectonic monster that sliced Antioch in half back in the ancient world, is still very much alive. It is pulsing, building up mind-numbing pressure beneath the Earth's crust. Today, this massive web of fractures cuts straight through 17 modern cities, putting at risk populations that easily cross the 100,000 mark in every single one of those urban centers. The great, deadly tragedy of modern civil engineering across this entire red zone region is that the strict building codes focus almost entirely on the strength, the flex, and the load capacity of the materials built above street level. We test the muscle of the steel and the density of the concrete in slick laboratories. Yet, the vast majority of the time, those exact same mathematical rules fly totally blind when it comes to the specific, erratic, and deadly geology of the deep soil, holding up the heavy footprints of these modern giants. The complete archaeological blueprints that could warn city officials about exactly how weak the ground is, block by block, are still physically out of reach, locked away like an unbreakable bank vault deep underground. Today, right beneath the bustling historic downtown of modern Antioch, at a jagged depth hovering dangerously between 13 and 23 feet below the asphalt, where everyday traffic rolls by, an entire shadowy world remains untouched, frozen and permanently sealed in time. Down there, in the pitch black, stripped of oxygen and light, sit the original residential floors from that doomed year of 526. In that thick underground darkness, the tiny items of a daily life brutally cut short, sit perfectly preserved. The old, spongy limestone frames that buckled under massive geological pressure, and the quiet, heartbreaking remains of those who never stood a chance of outrunning the first great cataclysm. Not a single, sweeping, large-scale archaeological dig has managed to reach and map out this 1,000-year-old layer with the structural precision we need, leaving the absolute most crucial piece of the risk assessment puzzle for this deadly tectonic jigsaw completely out of the hands of modern science. It is a blind spot in our knowledge that is costing human lives. The unbreakable silence of these massive, untouched underground ruins hides the documentary answer to the most agonizing, haunting question eating away at the seismologists, city planners, and historians of our time. What exactly was the mechanical blueprint of the collapse? What was the primary, invisible structural failure that brought down those heavy, ancient buildings packed with families nearly a millennium and a half ago? And why do these impressive modern high-rises, built with so much pride over that exact same loose, shaky ground, keep tragically, cyclically repeating that same failure, completely blind to the past? As long as the earth keeps guarding its worst secrets with an iron fist, and we keep building our future while turning a blind eye to the scars of our past, the sunlit surface will be doomed to dance the same dangerous steps with the forces of nature. If you stayed with us through this deep dive into history, and you truly value saving these crucial memories that time tries so desperately to erase, hit that subscribe button right now. The serious study of the past isn't just some dusty old collection of data rotting in forgotten libraries. It is our one and only true survival compass for figuring out what comes next. Drop a comment and tell us which part of this forgotten tragedy of Antioch hit you the hardest and shifted your perspective. Your support is the only way we keep this work alive. The channel deeply appreciates your time and your open ears. We will see you very soon for the next great mystery in our documented history.